Hello, this is Mike, and welcome back to Urban Legends and Mythology. And as a quick disclaimer, if you haven't noticed by the title of the episode, this does deal with some very heavy material, primarily the subjects of depression, despair, and suicide. And as always, if you are uncomfortable with that type of subject matter, I would highly suggest skipping this episode in light of a more upbeat one. Maybe go back and check out some of that American cryptid stuff. Those episodes need some love. However, with that out of the way, let's take a sip of this delicious Voodoo Ranger from New Belgium Brewing and get into the subject matter of the day. Today we are discussing a very infamous song, possibly one of the most depressing songs ever written, Gloomy Sunday by Rezo Seres, also known as the Hungarian suicide song. And if you've never heard of it, I do not blame you, because it was said to have been banned by many nations and many media outlets for several years. However, we'll get into that later. But like always, we're going to start right at the beginning, and we're going to start with the composer, Rezo Seres. Now, he was born on 3 November 1899 in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, and he basically lived the majority of his life in Hungary, around Budapest. He was of Jewish descent. He spent most of his life in poverty, and he had his formative years during some of the worst events of the early 20th century. He would have witnessed these events firsthand. And while his background isn't really mentioned in a lot of the myths surrounding the song, I think the events that he witnessed in his early life and throughout his life really influenced and shaped his worldview and his art. Now, for context, the Austro-Hungarian Empire really wasn't the best place to grow up in if you were born around 1899. He would have spent his formative years, his young years, all the way up till the time he was about 18 or 19, living in a dying empire that would collapse once he reached adulthood. So real quick, let's just do some quick history of what was going on at the time, maybe to get an idea into his worldview. So Austria-Hungary, it was the second largest land empire in Europe at the time, right after Russia. It was this enormous multi-ethnic empire, and it was extremely politically unstable. And it was really the last great hurrah of the Habsburg dynasty. And it spent more time just trying to hold itself together than actually accomplishing anything else. Because when you get a country that's that size and it's multi-ethnic, it becomes breeding ground for independence movements. And that was really the bane of this empire. There were all these independence movements, and the establishment was trying to hold on to the status quo. And all that political tension would spark the fire that would become World War I, which happens on 28 June 1914 when Serbian nationalists, they want to break away and become their own country, assassinates Archduke Franz Ferdinand in the Bosnian capital of Sarajevo. And this event kicks off some anti-Serbian riots in Bosnia, and the Austro-Hungarians, they use this assassination as an excuse to militarily occupy the country, and now we have World War I kicking off, with Austria-Hungary actually being the primary aggressor of the Central Powers. Germany and the Ottomans, etc., they were all just allies of Austria-Hungary, fighting on the side of Austria-Hungary. However, with Germany being a major player in the war on the side of the Central Powers and having massive influence within the Austro-Hungarian Empire, you can see how Germany ends up getting the brunt of the blame for World War I. And World War I is the most brutal, most devastating war in human history up to this point. And Rezo Seres, he would have been 14 when this war started, and he would have been, if not a first-hand witness, at least a second-hand witness to the carnage that this war created. It must have felt like the world was ending. And to further drive that apocalyptic worldview home, he witnessed the collapse of 4 empires within a year, right around the time he became an adult. I mean, right at the end of the war, the Russian Empire collapses, the German Empire collapses, the Ottoman Empire collapses, and the empire he lives in, the Austro-Hungarians, that collapses too. And then, furthermore, the Spanish flu pandemic of 1918 sweeps across the world and wipes out even more people. So, in the mindset of somebody growing up in this time, it's going to be a very dark, apocalyptic world. Now, imagine growing up and living through all that and being a young artist. In his case, he was a pianist and a composer. That alone is probably going to heavily influence his artistic style. And I believe that it did influence his personal style, especially when you look at some of the lyrics for the earliest version of Gloomy Sunday, the very song he would become most famous for. The original title for the lyrics was "The World is Ending," and the song was about despair caused by war and poverty, which makes sense because he writes the original version of this song in 1932 when he's living in Paris, because he's moved to Paris to try to establish himself as a songwriter. And once again, for context, in 1932, a lot of stuff is happening, a lot of scary stuff in the world. For one, the Great Depression is in full swing. Now, a lot of people, when they think of the Great Depression, they only really think of America, but the Great Depression affected the entire economy of the world, because even in the 1930s, America was a powerhouse when it came to the world economy. So what goes bad in America gets even worse across Europe. And the Great Depression, it especially hit places like Hungary hard, that didn't really have a developed modern economy and was still kind of digging itself out of the hole that it dug itself into in World War I. And there were other looming threats sweeping across Europe at the time. One was the rise of communism, and one was the rise of fascism. And in his homeland, the fascists were basically warring with the communists over who was going to control Hungary, which the fascists under German influence end up winning, which is why Hungary ends up allied with the Axis during World War II, but I digress. But it's not just the lyrics that make this original version of the song so depressing. What really makes the song depressing is the fact that it's written in C minor, and it's also written to the cadence of a funeral march. So now let's switch from history and artistic influence into some psychology and some music theory. Now, here's the thing with music. Music is very unique in the arts in the fact that it tends to have a deeper impact on our psychology and our mood as opposed to other forms of art. And it's one of the few arts where you don't really need a lot of context to understand the emotions that are happening in the song, for example. And it seems that with the case of music, the feelings evoked from it are more long-lasting and primal to us. I mean, it's not that hard to listen to your favorite song, or even just thinking about your favorite song. It can dredge up those feelings that you have towards that song, and it's actually the notes, the melody, that's what's really driving that forward. And in this very example, the song Gloomy Sunday, the melody is written in a minor C, which is actually very important in this context because in Western music, songs, melodies that are played with a minor chord usually sound darker as opposed to a song that's played in a major chord. And going back to the artist, he really wanted to write a song that showed this like crushing despair, or evoke that feeling of this crushing despair and emptiness, which this goes in line with his personal vision of the song because the basis of the lyrics is a reproach to the injustices of man with a prayer to God to have mercy on the modern world and the people who perpetuate evil. Now, due to the melancholy nature of the song, Sores initially has a very hard time trying to find anyone to publish it. One potential publisher that he approached is actually stated as saying, and this is a direct quote, "It is not that the song is sad. There is a sort of terrible, compelling despair about it. I don't think it would do anyone any good to hear a song like that." So even from the very beginning, the song has a reputation of being too depressing, too melancholic, so much so that no one wants to publish it. Now at this point, he's written the song, he's published the sheet music. However, nothing's really happening for him. He's kind of stuck. And that's when a friend of his comes onto the scene, who's a poet by the name of Laszlo Javor. Now, he had just written a poem because he was going through a breakup with his fiancée, and it was this really dark, melancholic poem. And essentially, it's a lament. The character in the poem, he's mourning the death of his beloved, and he's pledging to meet his lover in the afterlife via suicide. It's a poem about the soul-crushing despair of losing a loved one, like a wife or a husband. And unlike most other poems or even songs, this doesn't end with that little glimmer of hope at the end that, okay, I'm going to get over this, I'm going to move on, I'm going to be fine. It breaks that formula, and it ends very much where it begins, with that crushing despair and hopelessness. But anyway, what happens is in late 1933, Laszlo, he goes to his friend Rezo, who's written this melody that he thinks is going to be the perfect accompaniment to his poem. They rewrite both as basically a song, and then they release it. And this rewritten version of the song would become the most widely known version of the song. And for the first few years, it's not really played. It doesn't really go anywhere. It doesn't really become a success. It wasn't until 1935 when the Hungarian pop singer Hal Kalmar records it for the first time. Afterwards, it starts to gain a little bit of traction throughout Europe, and it's even played in Paris. A band leader named Ray Ventura started performing it, and he would ham up its reputation with unabashed theatrics, the kind employed by, you'd see artists like Alice Cooper or Ozzy Osbourne, hamming it up in, the metal scene of the 80s. He was kind of doing this with Gloomy Sunday back in 1935, 1936. And it was this very vaudevillian style, over-the-top, shocking kind of performance. So this performance would go like this. They would come out and they would pretend to commit suicide while playing the song. First, at the first chorus, the drummer would get up and, air quotes, shoot himself in the head. Next, the trumpeter, he would grab a fake knife and plunge it into his chest. And then a waiter would come out and bring a cup of, quote, poison to the saxophone player, who would keel over, leaving only Ventura on stage, who would sing the final verse with a noose wrapped around his neck. Which, to be honest, I think that last little part is perfect symbolism for the song, because when you listen to the song, you don't get that happy, everything's going to be well ending where the singer moves on and everything's going to be all right. It's as if the singer is singing this song while wrapping a noose around his neck. It's a very, very discouraging song. And now, since the song's becoming more famous, it's spreading, and it's in 1936 when two English versions of the song come out. One is written by Desmond Carter and the other is written by Sam M. Lewis. And it's around this time when the song starts getting a very sinister reputation, because as it grows in popularity, it coincides with a slate of suicides that happen across Hungary. And the common denominator when it comes to a lot of these suicides is there's usually a reference to Gloomy Sunday nearby. A lot of the times the bodies are found either clutching the sheet music, or the sheet music is close to the body. Now, with rumors of the song being associated with suicides growing in popularity, Sres, he becomes aware of these rumors and he actually laments, "I have become the suicide singer. I am devastated that this has become the song's fate. At this price, I don't need success." However, at this point, the success was really out of Sres's control, because it was going around the world, being translated into several different languages, and it was kind of a hit. But it's actually here in the United States in 1941 when the song becomes infamous, because it is recorded by the famous Billie Holiday. And Billie Holiday's version is actually the version which goes on to spawn multiple covers by multiple artists. And just off the top of my head, it's covered by Ray Charles, Elvis Costello, I believe Sinead O'Connor, as well as Bjork, and my personal favorite version of this song, the one that was done by Emily Autumn. And I'm just going to go off on a quick tangent here. If you've never heard of Emily Autumn, I encourage you to check her out. She's an amazing singer, songwriter, violinist, and an amazingly talented artist. But enough fangirling over my favorite artist, let's get back into it. So Billie Holiday's version of the song kind of sweeps across the world, and this kicks off the second urban legend about the song, and it's that urban legend that it was banned in several countries for its depressing nature and its links to suicides. It was said that in Hungary it was linked to at least 17 different suicides, and across the world it was linked to over 200 suicides. Now, to be honest, those links to suicides are circumstantial, and it's primarily an urban legend. However, when you find out that there are several accounts where they found suicide victims with the sheet music nearby or the record playing nearby, those myths come from somewhere. And while some of that could be coincidental, I'm sure there's at least one case somewhere where somebody died and that sheet music was found nearby. And yes, it's perfectly valid to argue that there were other factors that probably went into these suicides. Could have been mental illness. Could have been the fact that we're in the middle of the Great Depression. Could have been the fact that fascism is on the rise and we're about to go into World War II. And we're seeing a lot of that same devastation again that we saw back in World War I. And even in its homeland, Hungary, there was a famine going on. There was rampant poverty. So yeah, these factors could lead to suicide. And especially if you throw a song like Gloomy Sunday into that mix, it doesn't surprise me that people would commit suicide probably after hearing that song. Because when you look at your surroundings and you see nothing but despair and troubles, and then the art you consume is filled with despair, what hope is there when you're having those kind of invasive thoughts? So while I'm sure that that link was greatly exaggerated, I think the possibility that that could have happened at least once is true. However, back to the myth about the song being banned due to this. In all the research that's ever been done when it comes to this, it was only really officially banned in one country, the United Kingdom. The BBC banned it during World War II because it was determined to be detrimental to wartime morale, which makes sense because I believe that the last thing you would want to hear when you're being invaded by, let's just be honest, a bunch of fucking Nazis, the last thing you want to hear is a very depressing song on the radio. And to be honest, up until 2002, only the instrumental version of the song could be played on the radio. That's when the BBC finally lifted the ban on the song. Now, other reports of it being banned are generally grossly exaggerated. Like in the United States, the song wasn't banned. However, a lot of radio broadcasters refused to play it because of the nature of the lyrics and the dark, kind of gloomy, depressing nature of the song, which makes sense if you're a radio station and you're playing like jazz and pop and early forms of country and stuff. You don't really want to play this really depressing, sad song that's going to make people want to turn off their radio. So I guess it wasn't officially banned, it was just kind of discouraged and not liked. Of course, I guess if the goth subculture existed back then, that would have been like the number one thing they played. And absolutely no hate on the goth subculture. I actually love the goth subculture. Hell, I wouldn't be doing this show if I wasn't fascinated by that subculture, but I digress. But despite the growing success of the song worldwide, Rezo Seres would never be able to really benefit from that success. In fact, his life would take a turn for the worst. So the story goes, at one point during the early success of the song, he actually uses that success to kind of get into contact with an old flame who, probably dumped him years ago because he was a broke, starving artist and she didn't want to hitch herself to a broke, starving artist. But unfortunately for our composer, when he reaches out to this old flame, he finds that she had actually committed suicide. And when she committed suicide, she was actually clutching the very sheet music which had been making him famous. And it gets even more tragic for our composer. So with Hungary being allied to Germany during World War II in the early stages, Hungary is a fascist nation, and with anti-Semitism ripe in the air, And our composer, Reza Sres, being of Jewish descent, he is actually sent to a forced labor, or let's be honest, a concentration camp, which he would have been submitted to some of the worst, harshest, most evil cruelty the human race had ever committed against itself. However, he must have been strong-willed or just strong or something, because he survives that ordeal and goes on to survive the war. And it's after the war when his popularity starts to kind of wane. The song's kind of old and, he's got to make a living somehow, so he becomes a trapeze artist in a traveling circus, or a series of traveling circuses. However, at some point in post-war Europe, when he's in these traveling circuses being a trapeze artist, he suffers an injury. I think a lot of people say that it's a back injury, and being a trapeze artist, that probably makes sense. It was most likely a back injury. However, while he's recovering from that injury, he goes on to compose more music. He composes many songs, one being called I Love Being Drunk, another being called Waiter Bring Me the Bill, and he even composes a song for the Hungarian Communist Party to commemorate the chain bridge crossing the river in Budapest. However, despite this, he never recaptures that same success that he captured when he created Gloomy Sunday. A lot of people today would count him in that same group as those one-hit wonders. They come onto the scene, they have that one song that really everybody loves and it hits the charts and people love it and they all go out and buy the CDs, or I guess nowadays they just download it on YouTube or whatever. And then after a while, after that song kind of falls off the charts and loses its popularity, you never hear from that artist again. And it's actually extremely common in the music industry. However, despite having this world popular song, he never benefits from it financially. One reason was because he was so loyal to the Communist Party of Hungary that he never wished or intended or even tried to go to the USA to collect the royalties from the song. So there are these hundreds of thousands of dollars, if not millions of dollars in royalties that were due to him, just basically sitting in an account that he never accessed because he never had the desire to access them. And to be honest, that's the official historic story. It could have been that the Communist Party prevented him from traveling to collect those royalties, but we'll never know. And instead of ever collecting these royalties, it's said that he actually opted to stay as a pianist at the Kispipa restaurant in his hometown. I think it's Budapest. And it's kind of one of those like dive bar / restaurants. It was said that it only had a single pipe stove at the center of the dining room and was notoriously cold. And it was a favorite place for like prostitutes and musicians and those bohemian type of spirits, and as well as the Jewish working class, which was what he was from. So you can imagine him being in this working class kind of dive bar playing the piano in the corner while people are carousing with prostitutes and talking about art and music and all the other stuff you do in like a bohemian dive bar. And that's kind of where he remains until January of 1968. And in January of 1968, the infamous composer actually commits suicide. First, he throws himself from his apartment window in Budapest. However, he survives jumping out that window. However, later in the hospital, he choked himself to death with a wire, thus ending a very strange, very dreadful, very tumultuous life. And some even wonder if the song itself came full circle to claim him as a victim as well. However, the suicide of the famous composer would not go unnoticed because his obituary would show up in the New York Times. And on January 13th, this is what is written. Budapest, January 13. Reza Sres, whose dirge-like song hit Gloomy Sunday was blamed for touching off a wave of suicides during the 1930s, has ended his own life as a suicide, it was learned today. Authorities disclosed today that Mr. Sres jumped from a window of his small apartment here last Sunday, shortly after his 69th birthday. The decade of the 1930s was marked by severe economic depression and the political upheaval that was what led to World War II. The melancholy song written by Mr. Sres, with words by his friend Ladislas the Avor, a poet declares at its climax, "My heart and I have decided to end it all." It was blamed for a sharp increase in suicides, and Hungarian officials finally prohibited it. In America, where Paul Robinson introduced an English version, some radio stations and nightclubs forbade its performance. Mr. Serres complained that the success of Gloomy Sunday actually increased his unhappiness because he knew he would never be able to write a second hit. The New York Times, January 13, 1968. Thus ending the life of Rezo Serres. But what of the song? What are the actual lyrics of the song? Well, it's really only 2 verses, and while I can't play it here because every version of this song I have found is under copyright, I can, under the doctrine of free use, recite the lyrics as they appear in the original poem. And as you listen to them, you might realize why this song has the reputation it does. Gloomy Sunday. Sunday is gloomy, my hours are slumberless. Dearest, the shadows I live with are numberless. Little white flowers will never awaken you, not where the black coach of sorrow has taken you. Angels have no thought of ever returning you. Would they be angry if I thought of joining you? Gloomy Sunday. Gloomy is Sunday, with shadows I spend it all. My heart and I have decided to end it all. Soon there'll be candles and prayers that are sad, I know. Let them not weep, let them know that I am glad to go. Death is no dream, for in death I am caressing you. With the last breath of my soul, I'll be blessing you. Gloomy Sunday. And all I can really say about that is those are some powerful, hard-hitting lyrics. After I read that poem aloud, I literally sat here for a minute, just like in total shock, I guess. Which is weird because in researching this subject, I actually listened to this song like 30 plus times in all its different little variants and covers. However, there's something about saying those words out loud, actually reciting the poem, that really hits you in a different way. It's a really strong feeling that I didn't think would hit me that way, but I don't know. It just really makes you think about how powerful those words can be. But on that note, I think that's where we have to end it for this episode. And yes, I know we touched on a very heavy subject this episode, and I do want to state that if you are ever having any thoughts of suicide, if those invasive thoughts come in and you're serious about it, don't ignore them. Don't take it as a joke. Seek professional help because it's not worth it. As someone who has struggled and have seen people close to him struggle with those intrusive thoughts, I can tell you that it is definitely not the answer to whatever temporary problems you may be having in life. And I'll leave some links down in the description to any resources if anybody's interested or struggling with those thoughts. But as always, this is Mike. I thank you for listening. Go ahead and hit that follow button. Go ahead and tell a friend. Whatever you have to do, get the word out. Let's see this little podcast grow. Recently, I just looked. We're in 2 new countries. I have listeners in 2 new countries now. One was Norway and one was Argentina. So that's awesome. Longtime listeners might know that I'm on kind of this little quest to have listeners in every single country in the world. And if that ever happens, I will be ecstatic. We are 24 and counting. Also, if you're interested in this song or any of the versions of this song, you can pretty much find them all on YouTube. And once again, I would especially recommend Emily Autumn's version. That version is the best. And as always, I'll see you in the next one.